Picture this, 1860, a dusty street corner. You see a man, maybe 40, selling firewood, just trying to get by. You know who that is? Ulysses S. Grant. And get this, just a year later, he's leading the Union Army, becomes unconditional surrender Grant, and, changes the entire Civil War. So today we're going deep into those crazy early years of the war and how this, unlikely hero came to be.
It's wild how Grant's own struggles kind of mirrored what the whole nation was going through. It was like pure chaos, both sides just scrambling.
Right. Okay, so first up, got to talk about that first big battle, Bull Run, or Manassas, if you're talking from the Confederate side. What a wake-up call that was.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone thought, oh, quick war, easy win. Then Bull Run happens, brutal. Showed just how unprepared both sides were, just a mess.
You read about those people, civilians, coming out with their picnic baskets, thinking it's some kind of show. Can you imagine the horror as this unfolds?
Totally shattered any, romantic idea of war. And right in that chaos, you get figures like Stonewall Jackson emerging. This, professor dude becomes a legend almost overnight.
Holding that line at Henry Hill got him that name, Stonewall. Right. It's crazy how fast reputations were made and broken in these battles.
Exactly. War is unpredictable, right. Shows how some folks just rise to the occasion. And that nickname, Stonewall, man, that became a symbol, for the whole Confederacy, their spirit.
But while the East was reeling from Bull Run, there was a whole different story playing out in Western Virginia. Easy to forget, not everyone was clearly North or South.
Very true. Those folks in Western Virginia, they were diehard Union supporters, hated the secession. So they did something incredible. It basically seceded from Virginia itself to stay with the U.S.
They formed their own government, said the old Virginia one was bogus, and bam, West Virginia was born. That took some serious guts.
For sure. It shows just how messy loyalties were back then. War tore apart the country, but also tore up states from the inside.
Meanwhile, Lincoln, he's got his hands full just keeping the Union together. The blockade of southern ports, bold move, but leaky, at least at first.
Try patrolling 3,500 miles of coastline with a handful of ships. It was a nightmare. And then you got those blockade runners in the South. They became heroes, defying the Union.
You read their stories. These fast ships packed with cotton, slipping past the Union, must driven Lincoln crazy.
Exposed how weak the Union Navy was early on. And on top of that, the Trent Affair almost brought England into the war on the Confederate side.
Oh, yeah. Got to hear about that. What happened exactly?
Union Captain Charles Wilkes, he stops a British mail ship, seizes 2 Confederate diplomats on board. Bold move, but unauthorized. Britain was furious.
I bet they were already leaning towards the Confederacy.
They were, as a huge insult, demanded apologies, the diplomats back. Things were tense, man. War with Britain, a superpower, seemed possible.
So how did Lincoln and his people get out of that mess?
William Seward, Secretary of State, he's the key. Super clever response. Says Wilkes should have taken those diplomats to a neutral court, based on some old agreement they had with Britain.
So no direct apology, but a legal loophole everyone saves face.
Exactly. Masterful diplomacy. Avoided a war that could have been disastrous. Shows how the Civil War wasn't just America's problem, the whole world was watching.
Speaking of worldwide impact, got to mention those ironclads. Forget wooden ships. This was a duel of iron monsters.
Huge turning point in naval warfare. The future was right there. You had the Confederate CSS Virginia, built from the old USS Merrimack, going up against the Union's brand new USS Monitor.
I've seen pictures of the Monitor. That rotating turret, wow.
Totally radical design. And that first day, the Virginia just tears things up, sinks 2 Union ships, tons of casualties. Like the old ways were suddenly useless.
Yeah, wooden ships were done for.
But then the Monitor arrives, changes everything. It's like David versus Goliath. This small, nimble ship holding its own against the heavily armed Virginia.
So who won that epic battle?
It was a draw, but a huge one. Marked the start of a new era for navies, iron and steam replacing wood and sail. But while this tech revolution was happening at sea, Lincoln was dealing with a whole different kind of shakeup back in Washington.
Ah, the political battles behind the scenes. Easy to forget about those.
Oh, yeah. Lincoln had to manage all these personalities, decide who to trust with leading the war. Like, he replaced General Winfield Scott, old guy, with George McClellan. Ambitious McClellan.
McClellan, he was the rising star, right? Oh. Great organizer, but always thought the enemy was stronger than they were, hesitated to attack.
Brilliant on paper, but maybe not that killer instinct you need to win. And then there's the War Department. Lincoln fires Simon Cameron, completely incompetent. replaces him with Edwin Stanton, super efficient.
Stanton was a workhorse, got things done, brought order to the chaos.
Became Lincoln's right-hand man, essential for the Union's success. But even with these changes, Lincoln couldn't escape the economic crisis. The war was expensive.
War always is. Liv's A&D money, how'd they even pay for it all?
They had to do some wild stuff. Congress created the first income tax in U.S. history. Super controversial back then, but they needed the money.
Not an easy sell. Americans weren't used to paying taxes directly to the government.
Shows how desperate they were. And even more radical, greenbacks, paper money.
So no more just gold and silver, the government printing its own cash. Risky move, right?
Huge gamble. Could have caused crazy inflation, but it kept the money flowing for the war. Shows Lincoln was willing to take big risks to save the Union.
And amidst all this, there's Ulysses S. Grant, about to step onto the stage and change everything. But before we get to his rise, we got to clear up some stuff about his life before the war. You said earlier that the whole drunk failure image isn't totally accurate.
Right. Important to see the whole picture. He did struggle with alcohol, yeah, but he was also a war hero from the Mexican-American War, a good officer.
So not just some failed farmer selling firewood.
Way too simple. He had military skills and he was resilient, trying to find his place, but a man of principle, determined. And that's what comes out when he goes back to the Army.
Well, let's talk about that return and those early victories that made Grant a legend.
Taking Forts Henry and Donelson in early '62, that was pure genius, showed his skill and just how much he wouldn't give up.
And those, I'm guessing, were just the start of Grant's crazy journey.
They were a turning point for Grant, for the whole war. But that's the story for next time. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Grant going back to the Union Army. Let's get into those strategic wins at Forts Henry and Donelson, early 1862.
Those weren't just any forts. They controlled these vital rivers, the Tennessee and Cumberland, like highways straight into the heart of the Confederacy.
So it wasn't just winning a battle, it was about controlling those supply routes, right? Giving the Union a way to push forward.
Exactly. And Grant, he saw something others missed. Instead of attacking head-on, super costly, he uses the rivers to his advantage.
Yeah, he teamed up with Flag Officer Andrew Foote, did a combined attack by land and water. I read about it. Fascinating stuff. But tell me, what was so groundbreaking about this operation?
First, they hit Fort Henry on the Tennessee. Union gunboats, they just pounded the fort, forced a quick surrender. Huge morale boost for the Union, bad for the Confederates, and a big win for Grant. But he didn't stop there. Immediately went after Fort Donelson, about 12 miles east on the Cumberland.
That's where things got tricky for Grant, right?
Yeah.
Faced tougher resistance, almost a disaster for the Union.
You got it. He underestimated the Confederates at Fort Donelson. They launched a surprise attack, pushed the Union back, and for a minute, it looked like they might lose.
So what turned things around? How did Grant go from almost losing to a decisive win?
Calm under pressure, that's Grant. Adapted to the situation, rallied his troops, got them organized, counterattacked, and took back the lost ground. And when the Confederate commander, Brigadier General Simon Buckner, asks for terms of surrender, Grant's response:
Legendary.
unconditional surrender. I see why that stuck with him. Pure determination, no compromise, gotta win for the Union. Sent shockwaves through the Confederacy. Here's this Union general, wants nothing less than total victory. Cemented Grant's reputation as a tough leader, wouldn't back down.
And these wins, they had a domino effect, right? Union morale goes up, and those crucial pathways in the West, now they're open.
Absolutely. The tide turns in the West. Union's got the advantage now, and suddenly everyone sees how important the Mississippi River is. Control that, you split the Confederacy in half.
So while the East is stuck in these bloody stalemates, Grant's making real progress out West, outsmarting his opponents, winning for the Union.
The Confederates had to pull troops from other places to deal with him. Brilliant strategy, and it puts Grant on the road to becoming one of the most important figures in the whole war.
Was there something about Grant, something different from other Union generals? What made him succeed where others failed?
Well, he had the basics down: West Point, Mexican-American War, new strategy and tactics. But more than that, he had this quiet determination, a calmness, even when things were crazy. And that inspired his men.
Not a showman like some, but he got results. Sounds like he could analyze the situation, change his approach as needed.
You got it. Not afraid to take risks, to do things differently. Attacking Forts Henry and Donelson, that was a perfect example. He saw the opportunity, no one else did, and he went for it. Bold, precise.
Some people, they thrive under pressure, right? Challenge comes, they get better. Others fall apart.
Grant was definitely the thrive under pressure type. Cool and focused in battle, made good decisions when it mattered.
That's got to be essential for any great leader, especially in war. You need that steady hand, someone to inspire confidence, make the tough calls.
You said it, and Grant had that in spades. He didn't panic. His men saw that. They trusted him, believed he'd lead them to victory.
Amazing how fast he climbed the ranks. Shows he could adapt, excel in tough situations.
Skill, determination, and maybe a little luck all played a part, but he absolutely changed the course of the war.
His wins in the West, they were essential for the Union's final victory. But his story, well, there's a lot more to it. More battles, more challenges.
His journey, it shows you how resilient people can be, overcoming setbacks, coming out stronger.
Before we get to the next chapter, got to touch on those technological changes happening during the war. We talked about ironclads earlier.
The ironclads clashing, that was a huge moment in naval history. No more wooden ships. It was the dawn of iron and steam.
Makes you wonder, how different would the war have been if that tech had been around 10, 20 years earlier?
Interesting thought. Ironclads duking it out on the Great Lakes during the War of 1812. Can you imagine?
Tech changes everything. And it's not just weapons. Think about the telegraph. Instant communication between commanders and the leaders back in Washington.
Revolutionized how armies were commanded and controlled, made everything more coordinated and efficient. Another example of how technology changed how wars are fought.
And it wasn't just the military. We talked about those economic problems the Union had. Creating the income tax, issuing greenbacks, that was pretty radical.
Absolutely necessary innovations. The Union needed money to fight, and these measures, even though controversial, were crucial.
What did people think about all these changes? Did they support these radical economic policies, or were they against them?
Mixed reactions. Some people saw it as their patriotic duty, a necessary sacrifice to support the war. Others thought it was the government overstepping its boundaries, infringing on their freedom, especially the income tax. Lots of debate about that.
History repeating itself. The arguments we have today about taxes and government spending, they were having those same arguments back then, just in a different context.
The Civil War was a time of huge economic upheaval, lots of experimentation. The government had to find new ways to manage the country's money.
And those innovations, those experiments, they had a lasting effect on the American economy. They shaped the financial systems and policies we still use today.
The Civil War was a crucible for economic change, really accelerated the development of modern American capitalism.
It shows that the Civil War was more than just a war. It transformed American society, changed everything, from the battlefields to everyday life.
And those changes, social, economic, political, they still affect us today. They shaped our understanding of what it means to be a citizen, of equality, and what role the government should play in our lives.
The past never really goes away, does it? It lives on in our institutions, our laws, our values, our memories.
And by exploring the past, really getting into its complications and contradictions, we get a better understanding of the present and a clearer vision for the future.
Speaking of enduring power, let's go back to Ulysses S. Grant. We've talked about his military genius, his strategic brilliance. But what about the man himself? What was he like off the battlefield? It would be fascinating to get a glimpse into his personal life, his values, what motivated him.
To really understand Grant, we have to go back in time a bit. Remember, he wasn't born a general. He was a son, a husband, a father, dealing with personal problems just like everyone else. His story is as much about resilience and transformation as it is about military strategy.
Let's talk about that transformation. We left off with Grant being forced to resign from the Army in 1854 because of his problems with alcohol. What were those years like for him?
They were rough. Imagine going from a decorated officer to barely making ends meet. He tried farming, real estate, even selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis to support his family.
It's hard to imagine the man who would lead the Union to victory struggling to survive. What kept him going through those tough times?
It seems like his inherent determination, that same grit he showed on the battlefield, helped him through. Those years also showed his humility. He wasn't afraid of hard work, never acted like he was better than anyone else, despite his previous rank.
So when the Civil War started, it wasn't just a call to duty for Grant, was it? It was a chance to redeem himself, to prove himself as a soldier and as a man.
Exactly. He joined the Union Army right away. And it's amazing how quickly his natural military talent became obvious. He rose through the ranks, his successes speaking louder than any past mistakes.
And those successes, like capturing Forts Henry and Donelson, weren't just lucky breaks. They showed a strategic mind at work, a leader who saw opportunities no one else did.
You're right. There was a boldness in Grant's approach, a willingness to break from tradition that set him apart from many of his peers. He understood the importance of maneuvering, of attacking the enemy's weak spots, and of never giving up.
It's one thing to be brilliant strategically, but it's another thing to make that work on the battlefield.
Mm.
How did Grant's leadership style affect the soldiers under his command?
He wasn't known for big speeches or grand gestures. His strength was his quiet confidence, his ability to stay calm under pressure. This really resonated with his soldiers. They trusted him, they believed in him, and they were willing to follow him into battle.
That quiet confidence must have been a big contrast to all the uncertainty and fear that soldiers faced during war. It's easy to see how his leadership would have had a calming effect on his troops.
Exactly. And there's another aspect of Grant's leadership that we shouldn't forget. He was willing to learn from his mistakes. He wasn't afraid to admit when he had miscalculated, to change his strategy based on what was happening on the ground.
That takes a lot of humility and self-awareness, qualities you don't always find in military commanders, especially during a war.
True. But Grant understood that holding on to a bad plan could be disastrous. His ability to reassess, adjust, and learn from setbacks was a big part of his success.
It's a good lesson for anyone in a leadership position, not just in the military. Sometimes the best thing to do is admit you're wrong and be willing to change.
It shows how pragmatic Grant was. He wasn't driven by ego or a need for personal glory. His goal was victory, whatever it took, and that made him a very tough opponent.
So as we wrap up this look at Ulysses S. Grant's life and legacy, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they think about when they consider this important figure in American history?
I think the most important thing to remember is that historical figures are complex. Grant was a man of contradictions, a brilliant military mind who fought personal demons, a humble leader who achieved amazing things.
His story reminds us that history isn't made by perfect heroes, but by real people, with all their flaws and contradictions, who rise to meet the challenges of their time.
Exactly. And by understanding the details of their journeys, their struggles and triumphs, we get a richer, more meaningful understanding of the past and how it still affects us today.
Welcome back. So we've seen Grant go from struggling everyday guy to, well, a winning general. But winning battles, that's just part of it, right? What's next for Grant after these early victories?
You're right, it wasn't a smooth ride to the end. The next few years, they really put Grant to the test as a leader in ways he probably never imagined. He's up against fierce Confederates, political games, and the weight of command in some of the most brutal battles of the whole war.
So even those big wins, those were just the beginning of a long, hard road. Before we get into those challenges, I'm still thinking about Grant the man, not just the general.
Absolutely. And to get him, we got to rewind a bit. Remember, he didn't just pop out a general. He was a son, husband, father, had his own problems just like anyone. His story, it's about resilience, changing, just as much as it's about military stuff.
Let's talk about that change then. Last we left off, Grant's got to resign from the Army, 1854, that whole alcohol issue.
Yeah.
What were those years like for him?
Rough, no doubt. Imagine you go from this decorated officer to barely scraping by, tries farming, real estate, even selling firewood on the street in St. Louis, all to support his family.
Hard to picture that, knowing he becomes this national hero.
Yeah.
What kept him going through all that?
Seems like it was that determination, that same toughness he'd show later in battles. And those years, they showed his humility, too. Didn't think he was above hard work, no sense of entitlement.
So when the Civil War breaks out, it's not just duty calling for Grant, right?
Right.
It's a chance to prove himself as a soldier, but maybe even more as a man.
Exactly. He jumps right in, volunteers, and it's kind of amazing. His military talent, it just comes right back out. He rises fast, his wins speak for themselves, louder than any past mistakes.
And those wins, like Forts Henry and Donelson, those weren't luck. That was strategy, a leader seeing what others didn't.
No doubt. There was a boldness to Grant, not afraid to do things differently. That's what set him apart. He got maneuver, hitting the enemy where they're weak, and just not letting up.
Okay, so strategy's one thing, but putting it into action on a battlefield, that's another. How did Grant's leadership, how'd that affect the men under him?
He wasn't a big speech guy, no grandstanding. His strength was that quiet confidence, staying cool when things are falling apart. And the soldiers, they felt that. Trusted him, believed in him, followed him into the worst of it.
That calmness, it must have been a relief, right? With all the fear and uncertainty of war, easy to see how that kind of leadership steadies the troops.
Exactly. And there's another thing about Grant, often overlooked. He learned from his mistakes, admitted when he messed up, changed his plans based on what was actually happening.
That's not easy. It takes humility, knowing yourself.
Yeah.
Not things you always see in commanders, especially in a war.
True. But Grant got it. Sticking to a bad plan, that's a disaster waiting to happen. Being able to rethink, adjust, learn, that's what made him successful.
Good lesson for anyone in charge, really.
Mhm.
Sometimes the best move is to say I was wrong and change course.
It shows how practical Grant was. Not about ego, not about glory. He wanted to win, period. That's what made him so tough to beat.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive on Ulysses S. Grant, what's the big takeaway? What should our listeners be thinking about with this key figure in American history?
I think the big thing is remember how complex these historical figures are? Grant, he was full of contradictions, brilliant military mind, but personal struggles, humble leader, but did amazing things.
Yeah, his story shows us history isn't about perfect heroes, right? It's about real people, flaws and all, who step up when things get tough.
Exactly. And when we understand their journeys, the ups and downs, the struggles, the wins, that's how we really understand the past and how it shapes who we are today.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the life and times of Ulysses S. Grant. We'll be back soon with more explorations of the past, stories that matter, insights that connect, perspectives that make you think. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, keep the conversation going.